But as Hedy said, I was a professional guitar player. I lived in New York City for a number of years before moving to Vancouver. And I didn't play the oud, this instrument. I listened to a lot of Armenian music, but I didn't play it. But I always had these questions, different things would come up. When my father and I would listen to Armenian music, some of the words would be in Turkish. And I'd say, Dad, we're Armenians. We experienced this Armenian genocide. Why are we singing songs in Turkish? That's a really interesting thing to think about. It involves the history of how the music came to North America and why Armenians in North America are singing it. So it got me thinking about these different questions that were kind of going through my head. I started listening to old recordings from like the 1910s, 1908, 1905, 1920s, 1930s, from Armenian musicians and Greek musicians and Turkish musicians in what is now Turkey. And this music was amazing, beautiful music. And so it got me starting to wonder, like, what is the history of this music? And so I decided, thanks in part with the help of a grant, a BC Arts Council grant, to start studying oud a few years back, and to get my PhD at UBC, so I could delve into this music. And my particular research is actually not so much the historic music. This is what I look at as, what I'm going to be sharing with you today, is what I look at as like a foundation, like of a house, like a basement. But my actual research is going to be about contemporary Armenian musicians, people like me, and how they express identity through music. But you kind of need to know all this stuff before you get into that, because it's really like an incredibly entangled web that you need to be able to sort of think through and talk through. So I hope this all makes sense. If anything doesn't make sense, just raise your hand and feel free to ask any and all questions. They're all welcome. So I thought first I would talk a little bit about what do we mean by West Asia. And a lot of the music that I am into really is on the borders of this region. And so there's a lot of ambiguity with it. But in general, people refer to West Asia as this area, what is present-day Iran, Iraq, Syria, Egypt. There's a portion of Egypt that is technically on the continent of West Asia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman. This is the region that we're talking about here. And some people refer to this region as the Middle East, but now there is a movement to refer to it as West Asia, and specifically Southwest Asia. So as a matter of fact, tomorrow, I'll do a plug for the Vancouver Film Festival. There's the Middle East and North Africa Film Festival, and they're having a whole discussion about whether we should call it Southwest Asia and North Africa, or Middle East and North Africa. And the movement is now to refer to this region as Southwest Asia. And one of the big questions that people had is, well, Egypt is in North Africa, right? Why would you include that in this region? And this gets into history of the Ottoman Empire. So if you look at the Ottoman Empire, is this the right map? No, that's the wrong map. This is the Ottoman Empire map. It really, at its peak, the Ottoman Empire went up into parts of Europe. You know, if you go to Budapest in Hungary, there's all the Turkish baths that you can go to, so you see the influence there. And through North Africa, you can even see the influence in Spain. But musically, we talk about Cairo and music from Syria, music from Lebanon. There's similarities between them all, and music from Iran and Iraq. My focus is actually not on that music, because that's really like a whole other art form that you can get into. But this is why it's kind of grouped in this way. Someone has a question.
Now, is Israel included in that?
Israel, those areas are also included, yes. So, okay. Now, these border regions, the photos on my flyer that advertise this event get into some of these regions. For example, this photo here, was this actually on the, no, this is a very similar photo is on the flyer. This photo is actually from Crete. in Greece. These are Armenian musicians who were originally from what is now Turkey. And after the Armenian genocide, they went to Crete, but they were playing music from that region. And so how did it mix with the music that was already in Greece? Like, really amazing. This other photo here, this is of Rosa Eskenazi. She was a Sephardic Jewish singer from Istanbul. And the violin player who you see there, a Kemenche player, he was an ethnic Greek, and the person playing the instrument in the background, he was an Armenian. So it's this really, really diverse group of people, and they all lived in what is now Smyrna in Turkey. And 100 years ago, there was this great population exchange, and so they ended up in Athens, playing a music called Rebettika, which is like kind of like the national music of Greece. And she was one of the first people who started this music, and it's like, actually, when I first heard her sing, it was like 3 in the morning, and I spent like hours listening to her. And my wife, she woke up, and I said, "Julie, I'm sorry, my heart, I fell in love with someone else." And I said, "But don't worry, it's Rosa." And then, of course, she listened to her, and she said, "Okay, I get it, I love her too." Like, really, really profoundly beautiful music. These are people who were living in this place and were basically kicked out. And so what are they creating? So this is sort of the history of what I'm getting into. And the music is very interesting because if you are used to listening to Western music with a piano, there's 12 notes on a piano, right? Who here has played piano? Okay, great. Please don't hesitate to ask me questions, or if this is too basic, or you want me to get more advanced or less advanced, whatever. But I have a piano keyboard here. And I love Western music. I love the piano. I listen to Bach almost every day. But this music only deals with these 12 notes: C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, and etc. But the music that I'm now studying from West Asia deals with the notes that are in between D and D sharp, right? So in Western classical music, between D and E, there's just one note. But in music from Turkey, there's 4, even more than that. So real subtleties of pitch. And when you first start to hear it, it can actually be like, what? But I like to refer to it in terms of color. The color is a bit off on the screen, so this might not look like red and white. But if you take the color red, and you take the color white, and you take like half of each, you get the color pink. This is like, I'm referring this to as like, that's D, that's E, and that's D sharp, like on the piano keyboard. This isn't quite the perfect analogy, but just to give you an idea. But in the music that we're dealing with, we have subtle shades. Like, let's say I were to just add a little bit of white to that red. Or sorry, a lot of white to that red. We'd have like a much lighter shade of pink, right? Same thing with the color red. Let's say we add just a little bit of white. It's much more nuanced in terms of the melodies, right? Than what we get in like Mozart, for example. Although it does also exist in Mozart, but that's a whole other topic. Anyway, so I'm going to play an example of a contemporary composer from Cairo. Her name is Nada El-Shazli, and I actually brought her when I was curating at Western Front to do a piece, to perform, and you can really hear some of these microtones. They're pretty, she's really clear with them in her piece. You'll get an idea, and just give it a listen to here. But were you able to hear how some of the notes sounded a little bit like, if you don't know the music, you would say it's out of tune, but it's actually like not out of tune. It's just a different way of thinking about tuning, right? Yeah.
Just playing a piano. How does she do it?
That's amazing. So there are keyboards now where they're actually allowing it so that you can adjust the tuning because, I mean, I don't want to be a cynic, but like they realize there's a market where people will actually want to change the tuning and not just have it be those specific notes. And this is a whole other thing you can get into is how, for example, the accordion in Egypt, how they added notes to get some of these notes, or the piano, how they added some notes. And so there are people who do play this music, but the challenge with those instruments, even with this instrument, is that you play the notes and it's still, you can't waver from it, right? It just, like with the oud, which I'm going to get into later, you move your finger just a little bit, there's a lot more subtlety. But yeah, she's playing a keyboard and she's able to adjust that keyboard to get those notes.
What's the notation look like?
Well, that's a whole other area. So the question was, what does notation look like? And I wasn't going to get into that because I wasn't sure how many people here read music. But it depends on where you are. Like, there was more of a history in Turkey of actually using like Western staff notation, but there's additional accidentals, sharps and flats, that they have to indicate some of these notes. There's a different system in Egypt, and like the most famous singer in Egypt, Kulthum, she actually like refused to let her orchestra read music, so they'd play these hour-long compositions entirely from memory. So there is this oral tradition, and it's gradually getting replaced with notation, and you know, notation has its benefits for sure, but I would say that's a whole other great question. But yeah, it's a whole other subtopic and sub-area. I'm gonna go to another piece right now by an Armenian composer. And what we're gonna do, this is a piece by a man named Tachios Efendi Eskerian. He was an Armenian composer who lived in Istanbul. I think he died in 1908. There's actually no recordings of him performing. But his music is still played throughout this region. And what I'm gonna do is I'll play you the same piece played by a group in Istanbul. Then we're gonna listen to a version from a group in Aleppo, Syria, and then we're gonna listen to a version from a group in Cairo, Egypt. I'll play you the beginning of it each time. And so the reason why this piece is good as an example is because it uses a maqam or a scale called rast, which is similar to C major, which is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, what we listen to when we hear the sound of music. Okay, so, right? Does everybody know? So what we're going to be hearing in this is this third note, mi, do, re, mi. So in this maqam rast, that E is slightly flat. Okay, it's something where if you start listening to this music over and over again, like you might listen to, I don't know, like Bob Dylan or, I don't know, whatever your favorite music is, you'll start to hear these subtle differences. It is something you have to sort of like get used to. But what we're going to see is that in Turkey, that flatness is very, very, very subtle. Whereas in Cairo, it's much more pronounced. Right? So the piece kind of goes like this. Right? That's the first main melody. So I was playing that really like it would sound like on a piano, right? Not changing any of that third note. But if I play it with just it being slightly flat, right? Just ever so slight. Now I'm going to play it a bit more flat. Are you able to hear the differences? And it's not out of tune. It's just what we're used to hearing versus what we're not used to hearing. And if you've never heard it before, it might sound a little bit, I like to say it sounds funky, but it's just a little bit different. So let's listen first to the version by the Turkish ensemble. Is this interesting?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? Yes.
Are you doing Aleppo as well?
I'm sorry?
Are you also doing Aleppo?
Yeah, we're gonna first I'm gonna play from Istanbul, then Aleppo, and then from Cairo. And you'll
Somewhere between?
I'm sorry?
You said somewhere between the Turkish and the Egyptian.
Oh yeah, sorry.
You gave us the
Ha.
Egyptian and the Turkish one.
Yeah. So the Aleppo is, does everybody know where Aleppo is? It's in Syria, and it's just south of Turkey. Okay? So I'm gonna play 3 versions. So you hear what people play it like in Istanbul, how they play it in Aleppo, and how they play it in Cairo. Yes?
I guess the other thing is there's sort of like an equivalent between major and minor scale.
So the question was, is there an equivalent between a major and a minor scale? And there are some scales that sound like major and sound like minor, but we want to get out of that, that sort of major or minor mindset with this music, because it's not really that. It's Rust. Maqam is its own thing. It's like major, or Hijaz maqam is its own thing, right? They're really their own things. Yeah.
I guess the better question is that do the scales reflect an emotional tone?
I think they do. So the question is, do the scales reflect an emotional tone? Do they reflect sadness? Do they reflect happiness? And for sure, I think it also depends on the region where it's being played, who's playing it. I think when we hear some of the examples, you'll see how the same piece can change depending on where it is, and I think it feels different depending on the ensemble and the region that it's being played. So let's check out the Turkish version first. This is from a group in Istanbul. Sorry. For years I listened to this and I wasn't able to even hear the difference in the third because it's so close to what I'm used to in Western music. It's just really a subtle difference in that third note. But as we listen and more, we'll start to hear it changing more. So this is the group from Aleppo, Syria. No, this is the Egyptian ensemble. Let's see here. Let me get the Syrian group up. So to my ears, that third note is much flatter than the one that we heard before. It's starting to go down a bit. And now let's listen to the last group from Cairo. So that one is much flatter. Can you hear this, or is it? Okay, some people are shaking some. If you're not, it's okay. Yeah.
My question is, are all three pieces from the same time period?
That's such a good question. Your questions are amazing.
Well, I'm nosy.
Yeah, no, it's great. This last version, I think, is from a Sun ensemble in the 50s, whereas the last two are more contemporary. Even though the recording from Syria sounds like the audio quality isn't so good, I think that's a more contemporary recording. But the pitches do change over time. So I was speaking about Kulthum, who was a singer in Egypt, and on certain maqams, certain scales, over time, her pitch changed depending on what people were into. What was the fashion of the time. And it also changes based on groups, so ethnic groups. So for example, with Hijaz maqam, which sounds like this, I've been told by several people, I've never read it, but that Roma people in Turkey tend to play the second note a little bit sharper and the third note a little bit flatter. So in Turkey, so that they play, it's like super subtle. I'm probably not doing it justice and doing it well, but like there are changes amongst different groups. Also, even within regions. So for example, an oud teacher that I have who's from Syria told me that he can tell, or maybe he can't tell, but people can tell, if they're attuned to it, which region of Syria people are from based on how flat they make that third note in Rast. Like he said they can even go village to village. I don't know how true that is, but you know, it seems a little crazy, but my wife's work is in the Czech Republic, and I've spoken to bass players there who say the way that they bow changes from village to village. Like they have to bow their bass in a different way because the people dance. Like even a village 10 kilometers down the street will have a different way of dancing. So it might seem, to me it seems a little crazy that you could hear that subtle of a difference, but I believe it. Okay, but that was a great question. It definitely changes over time. It changes over region, in different regions, for sure.
Are most of the players Armenians?
No, there's a whole, you'll have the groups from Egypt will have Egyptians, Syrians, Armenians, like there's for sure, there's a range of different ethnicities in these groups. So, yeah.
So do they need to decide then which variety they play? I mean, can people,
Totally.
I don't know, can also
Yes.
sing in principle together with Fairuz or what?
Yeah.
Or are they,
That's part of the negotiation. So, for example, my oud teacher, Aram Bajakian, he's an Armenian who grew up in New Jersey. His way of learning this music was from records, right? He has thousands of records, and he learned it, and he plays and goes and performs in Turkey. People know him as being able to play this music, even though he didn't grow up in that region. And his group is phenomenal. The Secret Trio. He has a Macedonian clarinet player and then a kanun player from Istanbul. And that's part of what they talk about in their rehearsals is how slightly flat. And we're talking like minuscule differences, like their ability to hear subtle differences is what they talk about in their artistic practice. So for sure, there's negotiation in terms of how musicians navigate this. If you have a musician who's from Cairo, and you know, another interesting thing is, which I've heard people say is like, oh, they play that note too flat. That's not the right way is the way we do it here in Istanbul. The right way is the way I do it, you know. And so there is this, you know, but it's all good. Yeah.
Is the size of the note the same in different regions, or is it standardized the size?
In terms of like having like in
How long the neck is?
Oh, the oud you're talking about. This is great. I love this. Questions are wonderful. So this is the oud. And the question was, is it standard or is it the same? And this gets into a whole thing. You know, I bought this oud a couple years ago. It's from Smyrna in Turkey. And my friend Matt, who I love, I grew up with him, he's Lebanese. He said, oh, that oud has too many adornments on it. That's all that fancy stuff. You're not getting a good oud. You should get an oud from Syria where they don't have those things, right? So immediately my mind starts racing. What's going on? So no, there are regional things like Turkish ouds will always have these two holes right here and a big hole in the middle, and they do have these adornments here. And I've read there is someone who wrote a paper at MIT, so you know it's right. That actually does have an effect on making the sound not too bassy. I think someone's knocking on the door in the back there. Whereas the ouds in Syria have generally an oval-shaped hole. But that's something that only came into being in the 1950s with Munir Bashir, who was a great Iraqi oud player, and he developed that. And then Egyptian and Arabic ouds tend to have a much bigger bowl, and they're deeper in sound. And also they tend to have a lot more adornment. So yeah, totally there's different ouds. The Egyptian ouds are much longer as well. They have a longer scale length, and they tend to be deeper as well. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you. These are all great questions.
You have a question here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, do you know the difference between Lebanese and Syrian and the type of notes?
That is not an area that I have gone into in terms of like that specific Lebanese and Syria area. My focus has been on Turkey and Greece and that region, mainly because I'm Armenian and that's like the music of my ancestors, so it's my interest, even though my grandfather did spend a year in Aleppo. But there, yeah, I don't know the specifics of the differences between Syria and Lebanon. I also really love Kulthum, so like I've spent a lot of time listening to Egyptian music, and I'm sure there will come a point in my life where I delve into Syrian and Lebanese music. It's just that it hasn't happened yet, and I'm, each one of these musics I want to give time to so I can understand them, if that makes sense. So yeah, but I'm sure there are differences, and I'm sure that they're, once you hear them, you could spend a lifetime studying them, for sure. Like, I have a tendency when I listen to music to really delve into certain areas. So I'm like a huge Bob Dylan fan, and I'll like listen to him for months at a time. But with this music as well, when you start to really listen, like, for an hour a day or half an hour a day when you're cooking, put on some oud music, you'll really start to hear it after a while. It just takes time. And one of the interesting things about which I'm going to do now is we just studied one maqam, or we just listened to one maqam, which was Rast. But there's actually many of these maqams. And what musicians do and what composers do is they'll actually start to put them together. So you'll have Rast going to another maqam, such as Hijaz or Sabah. All these different maqams that each have their own flavor, and when you put them together, they create a really beautiful music, and you start to feel things. So I'm going to give you an example of that now. I'm actually going to play. And there's this word tarab, which is like, it's like a feeling that you feel when people really have mastery of this. And I never understood it. I was listening to Kulthum, like I'll listen to her every day. And I started to notice there's points where the audience goes nuts, like be screaming. And then I started to notice, oh, they're hearing these little things that she's changing in the melody, like just such subtle changes in pitch. But then you start to feel it and you're like, oh yeah, that's it. But you really have it, like it was like months of listening to her on a daily basis before I was able to like really pick it up. So if you give that time, it's really, really rewarding. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do right now, I'm going to play a solo piece on the oud called a taksim. This is an improvisation. but I'm not just making it up. There's a roadmap I'm going to follow. I'm going to tell you what the roadmap is. And I'm going to start in the makam that we just went over, which is called Rust. I'm going to play it more in the Turkish, Greek, Armenian style with the flat that's not quite so flat. And then I'm going to go to another makam, which I mentioned once. It's called Hijaz. And Hijaz sounds like this. Okay, so I'm going to go to that flavor. And then I'm going to go back to Rust. Okay? And there's going to be 3 sections to this. I'm going to start with Rust, and then I'm going to do something called modulate. I'm going to go to Hijaz, and I'll play in that area for a while, and then I'm going to go back to Rust. So you should be able to hear it if I do it well. And this is kind of like a basic. If you go onto Spotify or onto YouTube, and you search oud, O-U-D or U-D, depending on how you want to spell it, and then Taksim, T-A-Q-S-I-M, you can find like hundreds of recordings, and you can listen to them. And the art of Taksim is how you modulate, how you go from one makam to another. So you might look up Taksim Rust, and you'll see a Taksim in Rust, and you listen to it, and that performer will then modulate to different makams, but then they'll always go back to whatever the base Taksim is. Okay? So that's what I'm going to do here. So could you hear anybody? Could anybody not hear? It's okay if you couldn't. But did you hear when I went? I tried to be a little tricky. So what I did, and this is where, I mean, I'm like I'm starting. I'm beginner level, but like what I did is when you go to Hejaz, I could start like, right? But I tried to be a little bit less obvious. I played up here. A little bit, then so I really made that difference in that part of the maqam, tried to make it stick out a bit more, if that makes sense. I don't know if that was, if you listen to a lot of this music, you'll start to hear those kinds of things. So yeah, that's what I was trying to do. I don't know if it came across well, but like, and then I went back to Rust with this, like really making it very clear like that I was going back to that home base of a maqam. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Does anybody have any more questions or? Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if you're going to get to it though.
Yeah.
In the Western, that's what we think the scale, you know, is derived from the harmonic series. Yeah. Whether it's fifths or thirds. Right. Depending on where you are, and obviously it all gets sort of cut and for the equal temperament. But is there any evidence in your research that this? You talk a lot about taste. Yeah. And how taste plays a role in these different regions. Right. But is there any evidence in your research about any of these sort of Rust or these, what was the word you used for scales? Like
Hejaz.
Hejaz.
Yeah.
Being based on the harmonic series?
That's a really great question. And there are, like in Turkey, there are attempts to divide the octave into equal notes. So like each quarter step is the same amount. They're called commas. And as well as in Egypt, there's each half step is divided in half. So there's 24 notes per octave as opposed to 12. And I think this gets into theory versus practice, because while theorists will say like, oh yes, we're going to divide it into these things and it makes perfect sense, it's just like the Western system, you know, yay. In practice, musicians don't do that. They don't stick to those equal tempered notes. Yeah?
It's interesting because the Rust that you're talking about, the third note being low is it sort of makes sense in terms of when you think of a fundamental. And yeah. The partial is going to be low.
For sure.
So it makes sense that would be why it's heard that way, even if it was an ancient.
And I've thought that in some ways, like even as my ears are entrained into Western music, like this is actually more in tune than what we have on the piano. This gets into like the math and science of the harmonic series, but also it's not exactly. It doesn't also correspond to Pythagorean harmonic series either. So it's not quite that either, and depending on the region as well, depending on the time. I'm now like studying this other maqam called Saba, which I'm really, really interested in because it's really weird sounding to my ears. It has kind of like a minor third and a major third if you're thinking in those ways, but it also, those notes are actually like the minor third in all the recordings I've studied is actually super flat. So I think if you were to do the study of seeing if it actually lines up to the harmonic series, like as it naturally occurs, I don't think that would happen. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I guess the relevance of dividing it up is how the notes play together.
Yeah.
Whether they're adjacent or whether there's some overlap, because that's when the tonal complexity happens. Right? So it actually makes a small difference, makes a big effect in terms of that transition period between notes. Because like if you think of it, like the complexity of the note comes out. Right. When you're making a transition, and it's not like from semitone Western thing. It's like super complex, that change period.
Yeah. Yeah. but I also, like, the musicians don't actually do the equal tempered, like, it's just not exact. As much as we scientifically want to say, like, have it be like, be able to divide it up quick, so easily, so it's not just like perfectly in half. Like, it's just not, that's not how people.
I guess the nature of it not being perfect means that the transition is more complex.
I think so.
Simplify it down to what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's not like you can just, yeah. And actually, getting back to the piano, you actually, like, I don't know if you could have a piano that could actually do this music, like.
There's people who stick their fingers in the piano.
Yeah, to change the pitches, but yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I don't know, yeah.
What's that like for you to change from playing a guitarist?
Yeah.
To playing this? What is your experience?
Right. So, yeah, as a guitar player, I think I was playing for, oh my God, 30 years. I've been playing guitar for 35 years. Jesus. That's a long time. And so it's a very different instrument. Even though it has strings and it's played with a pick, a different type of pick than a guitar pick. This is called a rishi or a mizrab. It is a very different instrument, and not just because it doesn't have frets. Like, the not having frets is a big change. I would say, like, obviously, like, I have left-hand dexterity, so I could pick it up first day and go, like, that's not that big of a deal. The right hand, my right hand I've always had bad right hand technique, so that doesn't really make a difference. But really, I would say, in terms of hearing, like, being able to, like to precisely put my fingers where they need to be has been really hard. Because if you just do just the slightest shift on this instrument, it goes out of tune, actually. It's not correct. So that's been a big change. Definitely, like, it uses some different muscles than on guitar. So if I go for a period of weeks without picking up the guitar, it's like there's different things that need to happen. I don't know what they are. But I do think it has positively affected my guitar artistry in the sense that, like the focus so much on melody and crafting of melody. Not that I didn't do that before and I didn't care about that before, but yeah, that's just a different attention. And also, every time you get away from an instrument, when you go back to it, it's like a fresh thing again. So every time I pick up the guitar now, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember you. And so it's nice. Yeah.
What is the origin of this?
Yeah, so if you ask most people, they'll say the origin is in Persia and Iran, and that it then came east and came north. And yeah, so Persia. Yeah.
You know when they start playing it?
I think it was around like around 1000 AD, like in that time frame. I was just reading an article about it this morning, and that specific date is not coming back to me, but it spread out from there. And there's a lot of like names of different maqams are shared between the different traditions, even though the notes might be different. But yeah, and there's some instruments that are only played in Turkey, for example. Some instruments like kemençe, which is like a violin that's kind of played on your lap like this, it's played in Turkey and Greece, but it's not really played in Egypt, for example. There they play the violin. So yeah, there's.
Yeah, no, it's very popular in Iran.
Yeah, of course. And Iranian oud playing is beautiful. Iraqi oud playing is it's like a high art there, and I love it. But it's also a different system of scales, a different system of how you think about the music, of melodies. Yeah, but it is its own thing. I love listening to Iranian oud players. It's kind of like, I think of this like Turkish and Armenian and Greek oud playing is a bit more punk, if that makes sense. It's like a bit trashier, like sloppier, whereas like I hear the Iranian oud players, everything's perfect, it's beautiful. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You talked about improvising and then sort of coming back to a home base.
Yeah.
And as a theorist and with your musician hat on, how do you sort of think of like Western jazz or jazz as improvising and having home base as well, like compare and contrast?
Yeah. Well, and when if I'm playing jazz, it's like, there's a quote I said recently is it's like you have a dance partner, that's like a little melody that you're working with, and you want to dance with them. You want to dance well. You don't want to step on their feet. You want to dance long enough. You don't want to just be like, oh, dance for a minute, and then I'll see you, I'm going to dance with someone else. So there's like, you want to develop, and the practice that you spend is so that you don't have to think about it. So if I'm on stage, there is a part of your mind that's kind of in the back being like, C Dorian, G Mixolydian, F sharp, D7. Like you're kind of thinking that, but then, that's not the main thing. The main thing is the melody and how you're playing with it. Like literally playing. You're playing music and you're playing like a child is playing with toys. You're playing with that. I can't believe I'm playing Summertime on the oud. Oh my God.
Well, I appreciate that you're exploring and wanting to know the principles of the tradition so much.
Yeah.
You're able to keep it alive as a contemporary culture and art, rather than just, that's how they used to do it. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, yeah. I hope that I can continue that. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I hope this was good and informative. And if anybody has any more questions, please, you can stick around. Yeah.
Can you play more jazz now?
I don't. It's like it feels weird to me to play in a jazz way because it's not.
No, Hejaz.
Oh, Hejaz. Ah. I thought you asked me to play jazz, like take the A Train, Duke Ellington kind of thing. No, Hejaz is That's it. Yeah.
Did you use any of this while playing with very different people?
No, that was before. Well, also it wouldn't work with their music. It's not appropriate for it, So.
It'd be interesting to add some new flavor.
No, but that's a whole other discussion. But when you're performing with someone, it's not your job to add flavor. It's your job to play their music. So yeah.
Oh, I guess I've heard something similar to the loud, which is like a music in Cuba. And,
right.
I know that for Cuba, it's had Spain, whatever, say South Spain.
Yeah.
When I think of the loud is sort of similar in some ways to the oud.
To the oud or to the? I don't know about the history of that, but that's really interesting because there's also an instrument called the laout, which is in Greece, which is much more closely related to the instrument you're referring to. And I don't know if there's a direct connection between. That would be a really interesting project. But yeah, I love listening to that too. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, this is 3:02. Thank you very much for coming. This is a wonderful Saturday afternoon. Thank you, Aram.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thank you for coming, everybody.